So let's stop with the chit chat and let's jump right into it.
Okay.
We are at chapter 6 of the section of Hilchas Deis. What is Hilchas Deis? You know, when you translate Deya or Da'at, it usually means your thoughts. But over here, it actually means your character traits. So Maimonides has, do you see me, by the way?
I do not see you.
Oh, let me start the video. That's a good idea. Okay, here we go.
There we go.
Do I look a
Not
little
you.
like Torah?
So handsome.
Okay, good. So the point is that Maimonides is like you, not 100% unique. There was also a Bimbachi in the Duties of Our Heart, a book called Chayvus Halavavis, which was a few hundred years before Rambam. He was also talking about character traits. But Maimonides codified everything. He really made a code about everything. And that's a fascinating thing to be studying this. I'm studying this myself every day. And so we're up to chapter 6. So we're going to jump right into it. I see your face, Brian, so I'm going to be talking to you. So you answer me. You could shake your head. You don't have to put on your sound. But do you have a book in front of you? Move your head up side to side or up and down?
Oh, I do not have the book in front of me.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk to you as if you don't have a book in front of you.
Okay.
So chapter 6, Maimonides starts off with chapter 6 with the age-old question. Is it nature or is it nurture? What is the character traits of a person? So Maimonides says like this. It is the nature of a person that he goes along with the flow and the actions of his friends and his neighbors and the people of his community. Therefore, it is important that a person should connect himself, should be connected to righteous people, and to settle himself with chachamim, near chachamim, in order that he be able to learn and able to grow and learn from their actions. And at the same time, he should distance himself from the wicked who walk in darkness. He shouldn't listen, he shouldn't learn from their actions. This is what King Solomon said. Go with the sages, with the righteous, and you will be smart. But if you follow with the fools, if you socialize with the fools, you will suffer. And he also says, Ashrei ha'ish, fortunate is the man who does not follow the advice of the wicked. And similarly, if he was in a community, if he was in a city or in a country, it could be translated like that as well. But in a place, they have wicked customs. And the people in that place do not follow the true and good path. Maimonides is suggesting that you should move. Go to a place where the people are righteous and they have good behavior. That's what he's saying. If all the places with which he's familiar with, and all of those places, and the people that the reports that he gets, they're all, he has nowhere to go. Wherever he turns, it's all wicked people. Unfortunately, sometimes that happens. Or we're a little too familiar with that. And Maimonides actually says, he continues, Kimoiz manenu, he says, like in our times. Maimonides was, I think, in the 1200s. He could have been living in the 21st century just as well. So that statement that wherever you go, it's possible not to find good people, or he can't move from one place to another place because the marauders, he does, in those days traveling was very difficult, so he couldn't move from one place to another, or he's sick and he doesn't have the energy to travel. So he says, Yeshuv Lavadi Yechidi, he should sit alone by himself. As it says, in the book of Book of Lamentations, it says over there in a negative, in an unfortunate way, let him sit alone and be silent. And now that I'm thinking about it, Brian, and you said you're connected to the Stolics, and all the people over here are connected to other shluchim, that is literally an island. Wherever you are, you know that you're connected to a holy person who's connected, if I have to say myself, to the holiest person, to the Rebbe. So when you're connected to your rabbi over there, you could be wherever you want. No, not to take from the other people necessarily. I'm not saying depending on the situation.
Right.
But in your case, one thing for sure. You can always connect to your Chabad rabbi wherever he is. And that's what the Rambam is saying. If he was in a place and he wanted to behave properly, but the people didn't even allow him to act himself, they said they were forcing him, right? It was, what do they call it today? It was silent culture or whatever culture, where they dictate to you what they feel, and they feel negatively, and so therefore they're dictating to you negatively, and they're not letting you live. Then what should you do? Maimonides suggests, go to the desert, go to caves, just get away from there. Better than giving up and saying, what can I do? It's nothing I could do. These are the people in my surroundings. I have no choice. Maimonides says, I do not believe that that's ever not your choice. You could do whatever you want. Do not follow the bad ways. Mitzvahs, then he says the law number 2. Mitzvahs aseli dabik b'chachomim v'talmideim kedei limud b'maseh. So now he said, number 1, he said, a person is going to be like those he fraternizes with. Number 2, mitzvah, here he says it's actually a positive mitzvah to connect to the righteous and to their students, kedei limud b'maseh, in order to learn from their actions. As it says, it actually says a verse in Deuteronomy, in the 5th book of the Torah, of the book of Moses. It says, you should cling to him. And who's it talking about? The verse is actually saying it about God. Cling to God. He says, how's that possible? How could you cling to God? So he says, the translation is, cling to the sages, and they will show you how to cling to God. Therefore, he says, listen to what he says. He says, therefore, you should make every effort to marry the daughter of the tzaddik who's in your town. I'll have to speak to Rabbi Stolik about this. There's only one per. And a person also should marry his daughter his daughter should always be married to a Talmid Chacham, somebody who studies, somebody who's righteous. He says, even in your mundane activities, you should endeavor to do your mundane activities, eating, drinking, doing business, even with these people as well, with these righteous people. Always and to connect with them. As it says, this another place it says similarly a similar verse, similar words, and to connect to them. And the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, which we study every Saturday during the summer, in chapter, I forget which chapter it says in, but it says in Ethics of Our Father, sit in the dust of their feet and drink in their words thirstily. Mitzvah akalodim leves is kolachem samig begufe. Now he goes to another mitzvah. This is a famous mitzvah, very popular mitzvah, and it's called love your fellow as yourself. You might have heard it bantered around all over, but it is actually a positive commandment. It's said in the Torah as a to-do. And so therefore, it is a mitzvah to love every person as your own body. There's a very interesting time, if we have time at the end, there's a very interesting discussion about this in the book of the Tanya. Do you learn Tanya with Rabbi Stolik, Brian?
Yes. Okay,
very good. Chapter 32. Tell them, I need to learn with you chapter 32. Okay. Therefore, he has to speak positively, and he has to about his friend, and he has to care, and he should be frugal, and he should be careful with his friend's money as if it was his own, and He says somebody who takes honor, who honors himself through the degradation of his colleague, doesn't have a part in the world to come. That would be inappropriate in connection to this mitzvah of love your fellow as yourself. The opposite, you're doing a sin. And that's the second concept. Third concept. Loving a person who converts, a convert who joins us, and he comes under, as he says, under the wings of the Shekhinah. You're fulfilling two mitzvahs when you love this convert. Number one, just like it said before, you love your fellow as yourself. That applies to a ger, to a convert. But in addition to that, there's actually a specific verse in Deuteronomy again. It says, "V'ahavta sager," you shall love the ger, you shall love the convert. So when you love the convert, in effect, you're doing both those mitzvahs at the same time. God has commanded us concerning the love of a convert, just as he has commanded us concerning loving himself, capital H. That means just as you love God, so the same way are you supposed to love the ger, the convert. And because the verse says it's a mitzvah, you shall love God. We do it in the Shema every day. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu atzmai oyev gerim, God himself loves the converts, as it says v'oyev geir. It said that also in Deuteronomy that he loves the converts. So when you're loving God, God says, love me, love also the converts as well. Number 5. Now this is an interesting mitzvah. It says, if you hate your fellow Jew in your heart, if you have negative feelings, you're actually committing a negative command. What does that mean? The Torah says, do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not hate your brother in your heart. What does that mean? That means in my heart I can't hate him, but I could hate him, I could talk to him, and I'd say, I hate you. So we're going to get to that soon, what that means, what the ramifications of it. But right now he's saying, you're not allowed to hate him in your heart. And if you do, you're committing a transgression. But he says, okay, if you transgress, then you get lashes or you get a punishment. He says, no, there's no punishment for this, because generally speaking, the Torah doesn't give any punishments only on things that you have done with action. If you did something proactively, you did physically something, this is something in my heart. It's not something I did. In order to get a punishment, you need to do something against what the Torah says you should do. And over here, this is not called doing. But it's only he's saying that the Torah is saying this thing, don't hate your brother in your heart. It's trying to say it, that it warning you not to have that feeling. And if you do, it's a sin. However, he says, let's say you're angry at him in your heart, and then you hit him, or you curse him, you insult him. So, although he's not permitted to do so, and that's a separate thing, he says, you demonstrated to this person that you hate him. You didn't hate him in your heart, you hated him outwardly. So you might be punished for hitting him, but you're not punished for hating your brother in your heart. It's not included because it's not in your heart. It's not limited to your heart anymore. So that's what he's saying. The mitzvah or the sin of hating somebody in your heart is when it's limited to your heart. But if you hate the person outwardly and you're hitting the person or you insult that person, you're doing other sins, surely, but in your heart, you didn't. It's not only in your heart. When one person sins to another person, he shouldn't keep it bottled up and be quiet about it. So there was this individual, Absalom, in Hebrew, Absalom, who hated Amnon. And because he hated him, he didn't speak to him good or bad, it says. That's a problem. You have to speak it out. That's what the Torah says. If you have a problem with someone, speak it out. Verbalize it. Have that conversation. That's a healthy attitude. It's a mitzvah. It's actually a mitzvah, a positive commandment to let him know and tell him, Why did you do this to me? And why did you sin that thing against me? Shenemar, as it says, you shall surely admonish your colleague. That is from the book of Vayikra. Leviticus says you shall surely admonish your colleague. Now that has parameters, and it also has a large swath of what that means. So before you start admonishing your friend, you got to learn more about what that means. But generally, for our purposes over here, to apply it when you have something against your friend, have a discussion, speak about it. Don't keep it in your heart and let it build up plaque and boundaries and walls between you and your friend. And if afterwards, this person who you had a discussion with comes to you and says, you know what, you're right, please forgive me, you have a mitzvah, you should forgive him. And the person shouldn't be cruel and hold back forgiveness from that person. And it says in the verse that Abraham prayed to God. This was a story where Abraham and his wife Sarah were going down to, I think it was Egypt at the time, and he grabbed his wife and he was going to violate his wife. He didn't know it was his wife exactly, the whole story. But he gave him back his wife. And he gave him back his wife because this king over here all of a sudden has these crazy sicknesses. So he says to Abraham, please pray for me. Right? He said, I made a mistake. I didn't know it was your wife exactly. Exactly. So, but still, Abraham, instead of saying, no, you did something terrible, he said, he prayed for him. Number 7, a person who sees in his friend that he sinned, or he's going in a bad path. So you have a mitzvah, you have a positive commandment to try to encourage that person to get him back on the positive path. Still from that same mitzvah that you should surely admonish your colleague. So it's a mitzvah for you to try to get him back to the positive path. Somebody who admonishes his friend, whether this is a person that he sees sins against other people, or it's something that he's not doing proper, a mitzvah between himself and God. So he's not doing whatever it should be between him and God, right? So mitzvahs in general break up between man and his fellow man, and man with God. So let's say putting on tefillin every day. Nobody cares if I put on tefillin. The only one who cares is Hashem. So if I don't put on tefillin, it's between me and God. So let's say somebody sees something, you should speak to that person. You should speak to that person calmly and in a nice voice. You should let him know. You should let him know, I'm only doing this for your benefit. I'm really meaning this for your good. And it doesn't say this over here, but we have a famous saying that dvarim hayotzim min halev nichnasim el halev. Words that come from the heart enter the heart. So you remember that when you speak to someone, they could right away feel if you're speaking because you're trying to put them down, or you really mean it for their benefit. And it's our mitzvah to encourage them to come in a positive way from a positive place. If this other person accepted your words of admonishment, good. But if he didn't accept it from you and he didn't change, you have an obligation to do this a second time and a third time. The Rambam over here, he doesn't hold back his thoughts. He says you have to continue to I don't want to say harass him, but you have to continue to admonish that guy until he hits you and says, get away from me. That's what the Maimonides says. But if somebody has the ability to dissuade his friend from doing something bad and to bring him back to the right path and does not intervene, it's as if he is responsible for that sin itself because he had the ability to turn him away from that. So he continues a little more. A person who admonishes a colleague should not speak to him harshly until he becomes embarrassed, because that's not what you're supposed to do. Because it says, you should not bear sin because of him. This is what our sages said. Should you rebuke him to the point that his face changes colors? The Torah states you should not bear a sin because of him. From this we learn that it is forbidden for a person to embarrass a fellow Jew. Why shouldn't you embarrass a fellow Jew? You're saying I'm trying to admonish him, so I'm going to embarrass him. Because if you embarrass him, you're committing a sin. And that's not the way you're supposed to admonish someone. So, and how much more so should you not embarrass him between the both of you, even more so in public? So he says, even though a person who embarrasses a colleague is not liable for lashes on account of it, because after all, I'm trying to turn him to a positive path, still in all, Maimonides says it's a great sin. It's a great sin. And this is continuation, what he said before, don't embarrass him. That's not where you should take this admonishing your fellow man. Kach amru chachamim, so the sages said, somebody who embarrasses his colleague in public does not have a share in the world to come. That's a big deal. Therefore, he should make sure not to, he should be careful not to embarrass his friend, both in public or in public, whether he's a small kid, whether he's a big person, a small person, a big person. He shouldn't call him any names that will embarrass him. So sometimes we see our leaders call other people names. So that's not a good thing to emulate. You might want to emulate other things, but calling names is not an appropriate approach. So, independent of who, what, when, where, we as Jewish people know this is our directions. We could talk to somebody else. We could have a civil conversation, but names is not the way to go. And he shouldn't speak something that's going to embarrass him. When is this said? He gives a caveat. He says, so he says, 1 second. He says, look, we have the prophets that admonished the Jewish people in public, and they said harsh things against the Jewish people, that they're going off the way. And so Maimonides says we could learn from those prophets, and we could know that things that are between ourselves and God, you got to push this a little further even. And you might have to even bring this in a public forum to admonish that person. That's what Maimonides says. You have to be very careful with this. I'm going to talk, if I have a little more time, I'll talk a little about it. Somebody on the flip side, somebody who did something against me, and I didn't want to admonish him for it, and I didn't want to speak about it, because you know what? That person was, he's not too intelligent, and in my heart, I forgive that person. I don't have to admonish him for what he did to me. So that's the proper way to go. That is a nice way to do it. And so he says, the Torah is concerned only with those who carry feelings of hate. So if somebody hurt me and I'm able to let it pass and not be offended and hold it in my heart, that's good for me and it's good for them. That's a good way to go about your life. So Maimonides says this mitzvah is let things go up past you. Don't take everything so personal. Number 10, a sort of a new thing. He says you have to be very careful not offending the orphans and the widows. Because they're very down, they're in a bad situation. It could be even that they're very wealthy. But because they are orphans and widows, they are in themselves, the money doesn't help that part. Can't help that. I know somebody personally who is quite wealthy, and unfortunately his mother passed away, and he couldn't get over it for a year or 2 years. He literally couldn't get over it. And you say to yourself, you don't say to yourself, but somebody might say, he has everything in the world, but he doesn't have his mother. And if you don't have your mother, you know what that means. He says, and he says, even the widow and the orphans of the king, you have to be careful how you speak to them because you could offend them. How should one deal with them? Don't speak to them, only speak gently to them. And only be honorable with them. And don't pain them with your words and with harsh things. And he says over here in this case, with orphans and widows, I don't know about with the wealthiest of the wealthy, but he says generally with orphans and widows, you got to be careful with their money more than you're careful with your own money. Anyone who makes them angry or diminishes them, or he hurts their feelings, oppresses them, or causes them financial loss, transgresses this prohibition. Even more so if you're going to hit them or you're going to curse them. And this, again, he says an interesting thing. He says this sin, again, you're not going to get lashes. In other words, the courts that are in place can't enforce any punishment against you for doing this. But the Torah says, the God says, oh boy, if you do that, I will display my anger and slay you with the sword. So even though the courts don't have the power to do anything, because technically they can't punish you for what you do in these things, however, God says, I'm going to be at their defense and you're going to suffer harshly. There is a covenant between widows and orphans, and the way Maimonides says over here, and the one who created the world, that whenever they cry out because of being pained, being wronged, God will respond to them. If they cry out to me, I will respond to them. And there's been stories on and off where there were decrees against the whole community. The Baal Shem Tov specifically, I remember a story recently that the Baal Shem Tov saw that there's a decree, and Rosh Hashanah he was crying so much, and finally it was revealed to him that it was because somebody was offending the widow in the community. And God was listening to that voice. And he said to his students, go quickly and appease that widow and give that widow money and support her, because God is listening to her voice. So sometimes there's that voice in the cacophony. There's that voice that sticks out. And that's the voice God hears out of all the noise. The widow and the orphans, God hears those voices. He says that's if you're doing it, you're painting the, he gives it a caveat. And he says, if you're doing something to help them out, for instance, a teacher who's trying to teach the students they're orphans, and they know they have a free ticket. They nobody could harm them. No, the rabbi could say, you got to learn, and he's allowed to do what he wants in order to make them learn. And even when this rabbi has the ability to do this, he shouldn't conduct himself with them like he does with everyone else. Interesting ending. He says, still in all, you have the ability to do it, but still you should treat them differently and try to treat them kinder and with mercy, great mercy and honor. And he says at the end, Maimonides says, because God will fight their battles, he takes up their cause. And then Maimonides says, it doesn't matter if you're an orphan from your father or your mother. It's just interesting, right? Because what makes you feel worse? Maybe sometimes it's your father, maybe sometimes it's your mother. Maybe you say generally people feel more when their mother passed away versus their father, whatever. But Rambam says, an orphan from either one, God listens to their voice. Last one. So an orphan is always an orphan. Your parents, till the day you die, you're considered an orphan. But do I always have to deal with them with silk gloves till the end of their life? He says, no. For this purposes, you have to treat them kindly until they don't need any adult supervision, until they're on their own 2 feet. Rather, to be able to see all their own needs by themselves like other adults, then they're equal like everybody else. So that was chapter 6. That was great. I see I'm already at a minute, a half hour. And thank you all so much for joining me today, because I learned, and that's the best way to learn yourself is when you're learning with other people. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.
Thank you.
Be well.
Right.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Nice to see you all again.
Can I ask you a quick question, Rabbi?
Sure. Brian,
Yes.
I want to ask you a question before you ask me a question.
Okay.
Are you actually a descendant of the Kotzker?
We don't know. We really don't know.